I was only 8, but I can still remember that day as if it were yesterday. The day when the birds in our quiet town in Shropshire went from being ordinary creatures of nature to something much more sinister. In a bizarre sort of way, it seemed fitting that we'd later come to call them the Quakers, a strange nod to a darker reality than we'd ever faced before. It was a typical Thursday afternoon, and the school had just let out. My younger sister Faye and I were strolling back home as we usually did. Faye was excitedly chatting about her latest creation from art class, and I, in my role as a dutiful older brother, was half listening, half focused on the path ahead. That's when we heard it. A shrill, eerie cawing that seemed to surround us from all directions. Glancing upwards, I saw a murder of crows circling ominously against the sky. Their dark silhouettes were stark against the fading daylight, making them resemble eerie, ominous specters. A chill ran down my spine, a gut feeling telling me something was amiss. Looking at Faye, I saw she had fallen silent and was staring at the birds, her small face tinged with unease. Instinctively, I reached for her hand, pulling her closer to me, just as the first crow swooped down. The attack was so swift, I barely had time to react. The crow swooped, talons bared, straight at Faye. I pushed her aside and swung my school bag at the bird, causing it to veer off its course. Before I could breathe a sigh of relief, more crows began to dive down at us, cawing and flapping their wings menacingly. We ran, all the way home, crows hot on our heels. Mom was shocked when she saw us, scratched, panting, and terrified. But there was no time for explanations. Later, while Dad was tending to his roses in the garden, the Quakers came for him. Faye and I watched in horror from the window as he was swarmed. The birds were everywhere, cawing and pecking, their beady eyes filled with a chilling madness. Using the hose, I scared them off long enough for Dad to escape into the house. That day, our quiet town in Shropshire was transformed into a living nightmare. We were under siege by creatures we had once seen as harmless parts of nature. These weren't just birds anymore. They were the Quakers, and they had gone psycho mode on us. After that day, our once peaceful town was on high alert. There were whispered conversations among adults and urgent town meetings. Everyone was terrified, confused, wondering how something so surreal could be happening in our quiet corner of Shropshire. Faye and I weren't allowed to walk to school anymore. Mom drove us there and back. Everyone stayed indoors as much as possible, peering nervously out of their windows at the mass of black feathers circling ominously overhead. But the Quakers didn't just stay content with our fear. They seemed to grow bolder. One day, they swooped down on the local butcher, causing a mass panic. On another, they managed to break a few windows of the town library. It was as if they were not just birds anymore, but vengeful creatures on a mission. Dad tried to fight them off as best he could. He began carrying a large umbrella with him whenever he went into the garden, using it as a makeshift shield. But they were persistent, diving at him with an unrelenting ferocity that was terrifying to watch. One evening, after an unusually quiet day, I was sitting in my room when I heard a sharp, frantic cawing. Rushing to the window, I saw them, hundreds of them, descending onto our house. I ran down the stairs, shouting for my family. Mum, Faye, and I huddled in the living room while Dad tried to fend them off with his umbrella. But there were too many. The cawing became a deafening roar as the Quakers hurled themselves at our windows, at the doors, trying to get in. Then, silence. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than the noise had been. Cautiously, Dad went to the door and opened it. The garden was empty. The Quakers were gone, as suddenly as they had come. The following days were filled with unease. The Quakers had disappeared entirely, leaving our town in a state of bewildered relief. Things slowly started to return to normal. Faye and I started walking to school again. Dad tended to his rose garden without the fear of attack, and Mom started to smile more. But the memory of the Quakers, their sudden attack and abrupt disappearance, still hangs over our town like a dark cloud. Every time I see a bird, I can't help but flinch, remembering the terror of those days when the Quakers went psycho mode on us. We might have survived, but we'll never forget.